After 2 days of intense negotiations, China and the United States have reached a temporary agreement, also known as a trade truce. This marks the most significant breakthrough since the trade war began in 2018. It creates a win-win moment and provides short-term relief to global markets. However, beneath this surface are deep structural differences that highlight long-standing contradictions in U.S. China relations. Immediately after the joint statement was announced, Chinese state media launched an extensive propaganda campaign, declaring victory. Some nationalistic voices online even linked the outcome to China's military strength, claiming that a strong army would naturally resolve trade disputes. Other patriotic Chinese pointed to China's diplomatic confidence. After all, China only sent a vice premier to negotiate in Switzerland rather than sending a high-ranking leader to Washington. Xijin, editor-in-chief of the Global Times, quickly spoke out, calling it a victory of courage against hegemonic pressure. He said that China had once again won big. Surprisingly, some U.S. media also echoed Beijing's rhetoric. MSNBC declared that the U.S. had made concessions. CNN stated that President Trump's greatest victory was not the agreement, but his distortion of the truth. The Washington Post ran the headline, "China celebrates hardline leader after trade deal with the U.S." So, let's set aside the noise and take a closer look. What is really in this deal? Who made concessions? Who truly won? Who stepped back in this dramatic standoff? First, let's review the key contents of the agreement based on the joint statement. The United States will maintain a total tariff rate of 50% on Chinese goods, including 20% from Section 301 tariffs that stem from the first trade war initiated by Trump. Another 20% is from tariffs related to fentanyl imposed in February and March, and 10% tariffs were introduced in a global tariff increase. In return, China will only apply a 10% tariff on U.S. goods and will cancel all other retaliatory measures, including the export ban on rare earths. In other words, the U.S. applies a 50% tariff while China only applies 10%. Some media outlets only mention 30% versus 10%, but they did not account for the 20% tariffs that remain in place. Now, let's take a deeper look at the U.S.-China tariff trajectory in chronological order. Section 301 tariffs were initiated in 2018, covering most Chinese exports to the U.S. with an average weighted tariff of around 10% at the time. Under President Biden, the tariffs left by Trump were not removed, but expanded in some cases. By the time Trump returns to the White House in 2025, the average U.S. tariff on Chinese goods will range from 5% to 25%, stabilizing around 20%. Meanwhile, China's basic tariff on U.S. goods is only about 7%. This 7% nominal tariff sounds low, but in practice, it's a different story. Beijing employs a range of non-tariff barriers, such as VAT, excise taxes, and strict technical certification regulations to limit U.S. imports. These measures have long discouraged U.S. exporters. When President Trump returned to office in January 2025, pressure on Beijing quickly increased. In February and March, China did not take strong enough action to curb fentanyl trafficking, so the U.S. imposed 2 new rounds of sanctions, each with a 10% tariff, in addition to a 20% tariff on all Chinese exports. China retaliated by announcing countermeasures targeting key sectors like agriculture, energy, and machinery. But in reality, none of these measures were enforced. Why? Because China operates under a strict import licensing system where only state-owned enterprises, SOEs, are allowed to import such goods. These SOEs can easily circumvent tariffs by submitting a document called an Irreplaceable Supply Chain Declaration, citing Article 57 of China's customs law to receive exemptions. Chinese customs never challenges these declarations, so the real impact was only felt by a small number of private enterprises importing niche products in small quantities, products they couldn't obtain elsewhere. As a result, by May 2025, China's effective tariff on U.S. goods is only about 15%, up slightly from 7%, while U.S. tariffs on China have risen from 20% to 40%. This is the tariff picture before April 2nd. Then, on April 2nd, the day marking Trump's trade strategy, the U.S. launched a comprehensive tariff war, imposing retaliatory tariffs globally. Only China retaliated. Other regions like the European Union and Canada, although taking a tough stance, did not implement any significant measures. During this period, U.S. tariffs on China surged to 165%, including a new 125% retaliatory tariff and a previous 40% base tariff. China also announced it would increase tariffs on U.S. goods to 125%, at least on paper, in retaliation. By May 2025, tensions peaked in Switzerland. In the Geneva negotiations, China effectively surrendered. The Chinese delegation declared it would reduce tariffs from 125% to 10% and eliminate all retaliatory measures, including the rare earth export ban. This meant that all the countermeasures China had taken in 2025 were withdrawn. Beijing also fully accepted the U.S. sanctions. So, why couldn't China really retaliate? Because China depends on U.S. imports, especially in three critical areas: agriculture, energy, and essential industrial machinery, items that are irreplaceable. Tariffs on those goods would only harm China's economy without affecting Washington. And that's why Beijing found itself in a bind. The framework shows that U.S. tariffs on China are now 50%, while China's tariffs on the U.S. are only 10%. This brings the U.S.'s threat of tariffs back to Trump's original proposal from April 2018, which China had rejected but now silently accepts. Both sides have also agreed to continue negotiations for another 90 days. However, this 90-day period is retroactive from April 2nd, meaning the deadline is June 1st, leaving just 47 days. The two countries have less than 6 weeks to reach an agreement. If not, the U.S. will impose an additional 24% tariff, pushing the total tariff rate up to 78%. And that's not all. The U.S. still maintains high punitive tariffs on strategic industries, including automobiles, semiconductors, steel, aluminum, and pharmaceuticals. These tariffs range from 50% to 100%. However, since China exports relatively little in these sectors compared to others, the overall impact only raises the average tariff by about 4 to 5 percentage points when weighted. In conclusion, the actual average tariff the U.S. now applies to Chinese goods is about 54%. What does this mean? It's very clear. President Trump recently signed an executive order adjusting tariffs on small shipments from China, reducing them from 120% to 54%. Specifically, the tariff was previously 120% or $200, whichever was higher, but it has now been adjusted to 54% or $100, whichever is higher. The figure of 54% is the actual average tariff the U.S. applies to Chinese goods after adjusting for all groups and weighted averages. This figure has risen from 40% in March, an increase of 14 percentage points. Meanwhile, China's tariff on U.S. goods has dropped from 15% to 10%, a reduction of 5 percentage points. So, who has really made the concessions? Who has won? If anyone still doubts who won in this trade negotiation, just look at the films China is broadcasting. They say a lot about Beijing's true thinking. This is a rough translation of the extensive text you provided. Let me know if you need further clarification or adjustments.